Alrighty, you can go ahead and get started. Let's start with a word of prayer and then we'll get in. Father in heaven, thank you for this time we have to come together and study of your word. Thank you for those that are present here today and the other classes that are going on this morning. Help us to have clear minds and clear hearts at this time, Father. We might be able to take in the things that we learned from your word today from this great book of Lamentations, and just be with those that are not able to be with us, be it sickness or traveling, and that they might be able to be with us at the next time. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, let's open up to Lamentations chapter 1. We're in the beginnings of our study of this book. Now here in chapter 1, the author of Lamentations, we are operating under the assumption that it wasn't his, Jeremiah. But he's setting the stage for the things he will describe in this book. Again, this book primarily concerns the destruction. Oh, okay. This one is, there we go. Is that better? Okay. I will have this closer to my mouth. Actually, I hear myself cutting out. I'm still green. All right. I will try and speak up. Try to get this in the right position. Is that better? Does that sound better? Okay. So again, this is Lamentations primarily surrounds the destruction of Jerusalem, the one that occurred around 587 BC. One thing we've looked at is that a lot of it was the result of God's anger with his people because of their sins against him. Now, what Jeremiah also records in the text of Lamentations is the personal pain he's feeling as a result of Jerusalem's destruction. And so since these are the primary things that Jeremiah deals with in the text of Lamentations, it's for this reason that this book opens in the first 6 verses with a word about what happened to Jerusalem following its destruction. More specifically, what Jeremiah records in the first 6 verses of chapter 1 are 4 points about what Jerusalem lost when it was destroyed. The first point in verse 1 is that Jerusalem lost its people when it was destroyed. The second point Jeremiah makes in verse 2 is that Jerusalem lost its friends when it was destroyed. Verses 3 through 5, the third point is that Jerusalem lost its freedom. And finally, the fourth point in verse 6 is that Jerusalem lost what the text will call its majesty when it was destroyed. Now, after looking at these things, then what we will learn from these verses is that sin can result in loss. And we'll talk about that when we get there. But let's listen to verses 1 through 6 of this chapter, and then we'll look at the points. The text says, again, Lamentations 1, beginning in verse 1, "How lonely sits the city that was full of people. She has become like a widow who was once great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a forced laborer. She weeps bitterly in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. She has none to comfort her among all her lovers. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile under affliction, and under harsh servitude. She dwells among the nations, but she has found no rest. All her pursuers have overtaken her in the midst of distress. The roads of Zion are in mourning, because no one comes to the appointed feast. All her gates are desolate. Her priests are groaning, her virgins are afflicted, and she herself is bitter. Her adversaries have become her masters. Her enemies prosper, for the Lord has caused her grief because of the multitude of her transgressions. Her little ones have gone away as captives before the adversary. All her majesty has departed from the daughter of Zion. Her princes have become like deer that have found no pasture, and they have fled without strength before the pursuer." All right, so again, we're looking at 4 points that all deal with the destruction of Jerusalem. And verse 1, Jerusalem lost its people when it was destroyed. We looked at this verse last week, but we're going to look at it again. What does verse 1 tell us about the condition of Jerusalem? That's it. Text says, how lonely sits a city that was full of people. As Dean put it, it was a very busy, populated city, but now it's not. Now, last week I compared this to Salt Lake City. Very busy, populated city, all kinds of stuff going on up there. But I asked us to imagine that one day you drive up there, buildings are destroyed, the people are gone. That's what happened to Jerusalem, is it was destroyed, all the people are gone, and now that's why the text says what it says. But it's illustrated. The text goes, Jeremiah goes on to compare Jerusalem to a widow who was once great among the nations. Now, I asked this question last week, but I'm going to ask it again. What do we know about widows, especially in the Bible? They were alone. Any other thoughts? They were to be taken care of. Why? What was their condition? They're in a very fragile condition. Dean was absolutely correct. They're alone. But beyond that is they had nothing. Widows today, there's resource in our society, there's resources they can go to. But that wasn't the case in the Bible. If a woman was a widow, she had nothing and no one to turn to unless somebody was taken care of. But this is how Jerusalem looks. Jerusalem now has nothing because of what's happened to it. But the comparison doesn't stop there. In the last two lines of this verse, Jeremiah goes on to compare Jerusalem to a princess among the provinces that is now a forced laborer. What's the picture there? Royalty to slavery. I mean, that's what we think of when we think of a princess. Someone's in a very position of royalty, but the text also says she was a princess among the provinces. So it's almost the idea that she had some degree of authority over other places. But now she's a slave. So, any other questions or comments on verse 1? All right, so putting all these things together, the point we should see from verse 1 about Jerusalem is that Jerusalem lost its people when it was destroyed. In this verse, Jeremiah has painted the picture that Jerusalem sat abandoned of its people when it was destroyed, and therefore is like a widow who has lost both her husband and her children, and also became like a princess who once ruled over places but now is a slave. So it's for this reason then that one commentator says of this verse that this verse is a graphic picture of before and after. And that is the picture that's being painted. Here's what Jerusalem once was, here's how it is now, at the time Jeremiah is writing. So that brings us into verse 2. The second point, Jerusalem lost its friends when it was destroyed. Now, this verse begins with the text saying in the New American Standard, she weeps bitterly in the night and her tears are on her cheeks. Now, what picture does that paint? Now, that is the picture here. Sobbing, can't stop is what Christy said. So it's grieving. It paints a picture of grief. It says it's weeping bitterly in the night, tears on her cheeks. So Jerusalem and its people are in a state of extreme grief that is causing it to cry uncontrollably. Sometimes something happens to a person and they just burst into tears and in a very real sense can't stop, at least not for a long period of time. That's the picture here. So having said that, what else does the verse tell us since she's in this position of grief? He has none to comfort. Okay, so yes, there's none to comfort among all her. Now, does everyone have the word lovers there in that fourth line? Okay. Now, this idea of lovers is, now when we think of, let me just ask the question. When we think of lovers, what do we think of? What's that, Dean? Okay, so there's the idea of romance. It's also the idea of we have someone who we have affection toward. Now, this word's important because one thing we should understand here is that what Jeremiah says here in this statement about lovers, it recalls a thought that we read about in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 1. Again, Lamentations and the book of Jeremiah have some overlap. In Jeremiah 3, verse 1, God refers to Jerusalem as a harlot with many lovers. Now, for those of you that were in my Hosea class, which was the majority of you here, what's a harlot? A prostitute. Now, applying that to Jeremiah 3, verse 1, is that God's people had gone off into idol worship, but that was compared to the idea of harlotry. They were acting as prostitutes, going out and cheating on their husband who was God. Now, if that's what Jeremiah has in mind here, what he says in these second two lines of verse 2 refers to the fact that no one with whom Jerusalem had relationships was comforting them. They'd gone through this time of grief, through the destruction. No one was there to help them. And again, that's because they'd built all these relationships with other nations, which God did not want. But when it came time, their time of need, those nations didn't help them. Dean, you had your hand up. Well, Dean, you just gave me my illustration on what this text is talking about. Dean just told the story, if you didn't hear him, about how he had a really bad car accident. He was in the hospital for a month. He had a lot of friends, but only one hitchhiked, is what Dean said, to come up and see him. That's a perfect illustration of what Jeremiah is saying here. Jerusalem had all these friends, but the text says they dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. So according to the language of this verse, what did Jerusalem's quote-unquote friends do? Turn their back on Jerusalem. According to the story Dean told, all his quote-unquote friends turned their back on him when he was in the hospital for a month. So as the result being, in Jerusalem's case, the friends became enemies. So this continues to paint the picture that Jerusalem had found itself to be without comfort during this time of grieving when the city was destroyed. Those people they believed to be their friends were their enemies. So thank you for that story, Dean. It very, very well illustrates what Jeremiah is saying here. Anything else on verse 2? Yep, tells it the way it is. So the point here is that Jerusalem lost its friends when it was destroyed. Something else that was lost in the destruction of Jerusalem was the friendships Jerusalem had with the nations around them. Now, with that in mind, something else we should be reminded of here is that there are numerous Old Testament passages that show Jerusalem as having made alliances or friends with other nations. One of them, Jeremiah chapter 37, verses 5 through 8, where we read about Egypt. Egypt had set it out to come to Jerusalem's aid, but in the end, Egypt turned its back on Jerusalem and left Jerusalem all on its own. Again, that's Jeremiah 37, verses 5 through 8. But that's just one of several examples where we read about Jerusalem being left on its own by those it believed to be their friends. So that brings us to verses 3 through 5, the third point we'll be looking at, and that is that Jerusalem lost its freedom when it was destroyed. Now, here in verse 3, Jeremiah turns his attention to Judah. Judah is the region in which Jerusalem is located. But what's happened to Judah there in verse 3? Do you have the word captivity there? Okay. That's good, because what the New American Standard has is exile. It is going back to that idea of Judah going off into captivity. Now that captivity is lined out on that thing on the wall that you have over in the fellowship hall. There's a point in history where it did go off into captivity, the Babylonian captivity. But why did this happen according to the language of the text? Okay, that's true, there's sin, but what does the text say? Affliction and hard servitude. Now what's affliction and hard servitude? What's involved there? Nobody's being good to you. It's difficulty. Hard servitude continues to paint the slavery picture. But even before Jerusalem was destroyed, they were already going through some hard times. And the result of that was that they did not find rest. Judah is just synonymous with Jerusalem again. But Judah had gone through this long period of difficulty and hard service before being forced to leave their homeland, going off into the exile or captivity. And another result of that is that she dwelt among the nations. And what does that mean? What's that? I heard two voices, so. She's dwelling among the nations. Does anyone remember what that means? Right, they were scattered. They went off into exile, but all of them went to different places. Some of them did go off into Babylon, but we saw in Hosea that some people would end up back in Egypt. But the point here is that they were forced to leave their homeland, to live among people who were not their own, and because they were captured by their enemies. So as a result, anything else on verse 3 before we go to verse 4? All right, let's go to verse 4. Jeremiah turns his attention to what the text calls the roads of Zion. Now, what's the condition of these roads of Zion, if that's what everybody has? They're not being used. Now, can anyone remind me why Zion's significant? It's another name for Jerusalem, but more specifically, Mount Zion is the mountain on which Jerusalem was located. But yeah, Zion, just like Judah, is synonymous with Jerusalem. But the text says these roads of Zion are in mourning. Why? None come to the festival. Nobody's going to Jerusalem. Why? There's nothing there for them. It's not safe. It's been destroyed. That's the point we're dealing with. So as a result, there's no festivals going on there. Its gates have been abandoned. But what else does verse 4 tell us about the priest and the virgins? If that's what everybody has. Okay. And how are the priests feeling about this? Right, so the priests, they're in pain. And does everyone have the word virgins there, or do have a different word? Yeah? Okay. So can anyone tell me who these virgins are? If you don't know, that's okay. Maybe. Right. Now that's on the right track, but it seems to be the word virgin, you might run into some translations that say young maidens or young women. That's who these virgins are. But the text is saying they're suffering too, and so we have to ask the question, why? One thing that would happen, we know from these festivals and stuff, people from all over would come to Jerusalem. Now, one thing that created for these young women is they'd meet someone that they might possibly marry. But now Jerusalem's been destroyed, those festivals aren't going on. These young women aren't going to meet any potential spouses. So they're suffering too, along with the priest. And the end result of that is that all of Jerusalem is bitter, the text says there in that last line of the verse. I'll ask again, does everyone have the word bitter there at the end of verse 4? Or do they have a different word? Bitterness? Okay. Now that word, that idea of Jerusalem being bitter, it's an idea that simply means that Jerusalem as a whole has entered into this time of difficulty because of its destruction. It's completely destroyed. No festivals are going on. The roads of Zion are in mourning, as the text has said. So it's great difficulty. Everybody's suffering. So that's a lot of information on verse 4. Anything else on verse 4? All right. Now, what does verse 5 tell us? You have the word adversary there? Okay. Yeah, adversary is just another word for enemies. But now the attention is on the enemies about what they're doing. They become their master. I'll just read again. Her adversaries have become her masters. Her enemies prosper, for the Lord has caused her grief because of the multitude of her transgressions. Her little ones have gone away as captives before the adversary. So according to the language of this verse, what's happened? Okay, so the enemies, yes, overtook everything. According to this verse, who was involved in all this? Who caused it to happen? The Lord. Now again, this is all happening because of God's people's sin, Jerusalem's sins against him. But the text uses this language of, does everyone have the phrase little ones? Let me ask that question first. Her children? Okay. So we have to ask how this word children or little ones is being used. Given that this is talking in a very literal sense in some ways, part of the picture this verse is painting is that even the children of Jerusalem are suffering. Now, what do we know about children? They're resilient. They're innocent. That's an important idea here. Even the innocent people of Jerusalem are suffering. The children. They're suffering the consequences of the sins committed by the people of Jerusalem. And they're also going off as prisoners of their enemies. So but part of the point here again is also that God has caused this. God has brought this upon them. Not to be mean, but because this is the last attempt to bring his people to repentance, this difficulty that they're going through. Exactly. Right. Right. All kinds of sins were going on. Now, something else we have to remember on this point is that God had given them warnings before this point. He sent them the prophets, Jeremiah being one of them. And this could have been avoided. But they insisted on being in their sin, so God said, okay, enough's enough. Here's what's going to happen. Anything else on verse 5? Andrew? Yeah. Right. That's true. This world would be world would be a lot worse place without justice. So, anything else on verse 5? All right. So the point we should see from verses 3 through 5 about Jerusalem is that Jerusalem lost its freedom when it was destroyed. This is seen in the fact that Judah was forced into slavery as a result of being conquered by the nations around them. We also see it in the fact that Jerusalem was left abandoned and its people were in a time of great pain. And finally, the slavery of Jerusalem is seen in the fact that it was enslaved by its enemies who were being successful, while Jerusalem was forced to grieve by the Lord because of its sins and its children going away as prisoners of Jerusalem's enemies. That brings us into verse 6. Go ahead, Dean. It's really hard to change what you're doing and what? Let me hear that. That's true. It's hard to change what you're doing when you don't think you need to. And that was part of the attitude here of God's people. They didn't think they needed to change, but God was showing them otherwise. So this brings us into verse 6. Jerusalem lost its majesty when it was destroyed. Now, there at the beginning of verse 6, the text says, all her majesty has departed from the daughter of Zion. Does everyone have the word majesty there? Or do we? What's that? Beauty? Okay. Splendor? I've seen splendor. But when it says all the splendor or beauty has departed from the daughter of Zion, what does that mean? Okay, let's go. Or I might say lost her innocence, her youth. But this word majesty or beauty or splendor, it comes from a word that has the idea of honor. Another word we might plug in there is glory. But here Jeremiah is recording that what was honorable about Jerusalem had gone away. But here we see Jerusalem being referred to as the daughter of Zion. Again, Mount Zion is where Jerusalem is located, and therefore Jerusalem is sometimes pictured as the daughter of Zion, because Jerusalem's a city on that mountain. But the point here is that Zion's daughter, Jerusalem, had lost what the text calls its majesty. Everything that made it honorable was lost. So as a result of these things, in the second two lines of this verse, Jeremiah says that Jerusalem's princes have become like deer that have found no pasture. Now, what's the comparison there? Deer that have found no pasture. Okay, they have no reason to stay there, but what else do we think of with a deer that has found no pasture? Okay, a resting place. What did you say, Dad? They're weak because they're hungry. But this is applied to the princes. They've lost their royalty. And so they're in a position where they're like this deer, where they can't get any food. And Elaine, did you say something? Okay. So in the last two lines of this verse, Jeremiah says that they have fled without strength before the pursuer. And that's where we get this weakness idea. He's continuing to compare the princes of Jerusalem to deer, but is making the point that they have weakly run away from those who are pursuing them. So they've been weakened. This weakness comes from their enemies. Their enemies have taken everything away from them. And so they're just barely being able to run away. Now, continuing with the deer imagery, we might compare this to a deer who's been shot but hasn't been killed. And it's just limping along trying to get away. Anything else on verse 6? All right. So, putting all these things together, the point we should see from this verse about Jerusalem is that Jerusalem lost its majesty when it was destroyed. Something else Jerusalem lost in its destruction was its majesty, royalty, or everything that made it honorable. This is seen in the fact that their princes were made to be like deer with nothing to eat. And it's also seen in the fact that these princes weakly ran away from those who were pursuing them. So putting verses 1 through 6 of this chapter of Lamentations together, the point we should be left with is that Jerusalem lost something when it was destroyed. Lost its people, its friends, its freedom, and finally its majesty when it was destroyed. But this was all because of sin. And so sin in our lives, if we're caught up in it, it can cause loss. It can cause the loss of life in some cases. It can cause the loss of friendships. Sin has also been pictured as something that can enslave us. Not always literally, but sin is pictured as a slave master sometimes. And sin can also cause us to lose honor in some cases. So we have to guard against sin so that we do not suffer loss. Now again, those are just some applications from what we studied today. Anything else on these verses? Andrew, did you have something? That's true. That's true. I mean, we saw in these verses that the children of Jerusalem suffered because of the sins that they didn't commit in this case. Anything else? All right. Dad, will you close us with prayer?